August 17, 1944. 4 in the afternoon, a small apartment in the town of Digne-les-Bains, southeastern France. A woman sits across a table from a Belgian officer wearing the uniform of the SS. She is 36 years old, she has no weapon, she has no army. She has no radio that works. 3 men are sitting in a prison cell 400 yards away, and they are scheduled to die before sunset. She has exactly one thing in her possession that might save them. 2 million francs in a leather bag, and a mouth full of lies. Her name is Christine Granville. She is a Polish countess. She is Britain's longest-serving female secret agent of the Second World War. And in the next 3 hours, she will either talk 3 men out of a Gestapo execution, or she will be shot alongside them. This is the story of how one woman walked into a nest of killers and bluffed her way out with 3 lives that the entire Allied war machine could not save. Her real name was Marie Christina Janina Skarbek. She was born on May 1, 1908 in Warsaw, Poland. Her father was Count Jerzy Skarbek, a Roman Catholic aristocrat from old Polish-Lithuanian nobility. Her mother was Stefania Goldfeder, the daughter of one of Warsaw's wealthiest Jewish banking families. The marriage was unusual for its time. A Catholic count and a Jewish banker's daughter. The family had deep roots in Polish history. A distant relative, Friedrich Skarbek, had been the godfather of Frederick Chopin and had designed Warsaw's Pawiak prison. Another relative, Włodzimierz Krzyżanowski, had fought as a Union general in the American Civil War. Krystyna grew up on a country estate outside Warsaw. She rode horses astride when other girls rode side-saddle. She skied at Zakopane in the Tatra Mountains when skiing was still considered dangerous for women. She swam in frozen rivers. She climbed mountains. Her father adored her. He called her his wild one. But Count Jerzy Skarbek was a better aristocrat than a businessman. He spent money he did not have. He borrowed against land he could not keep. By the time Krystyna was a teenager, the family fortune was gone. Her father died in 1930, broken and bankrupt. Krystyna was 22 years old with no money, no estate, and no prospects. She took a job at a Fiat automobile dealership in Warsaw. The exhaust fumes damaged her lungs and left small scars on her chest. Those scars would one day save her life. In 1930, she entered the Miss Poland beauty contest. She was a runner-up. She married a businessman named Gustor Getlich that same year. The marriage lasted barely a year. In 1938, she married again, this time to a writer and adventurer named Jerzy Gizicki. He took a diplomatic posting to Ethiopia. She followed him briefly, then returned to Europe. The marriage was already failing. But Krystyna Skarbek was not interested in marriage. She was interested in something else entirely. She was interested in war. On September 1, 1939, Germany invaded Poland. Krystyna was in London with her husband. She watched the news from Warsaw with horror. Her mother was still there. Her brother was still there. Poland was being destroyed, and she was sitting in a London flat doing nothing. She could not accept that. Within weeks, she walked into a British government office and volunteered to spy for Britain. She was not recruited. She was not approached. She approached them. She told the British she could ski across the Tatra Mountains into occupied Poland, smuggle intelligence out, and build networks of informants behind German lines. The British were skeptical. She was a young Polish woman with no military training, no intelligence experience, and no official standing. But one journalist who knew her, Frederick Voigt, introduced her to the Secret Intelligence Service. An early report on her file described her as a flaming Polish patriot, an expert skier, and a great adventuress. The British decided she was worth the risk. In December 1939, she left London for Budapest, Hungary, which was still neutral at the time. She travelled under journalistic cover, posing as a reporter. From Budapest, she planned to cross into occupied Poland. The Tatra Mountains stood between Hungary and Poland, a wall of granite peaks rising to over 8,000 feet, covered in deep snow and patrolled by German and Slovak border guards. No sane person would attempt the crossing in winter. Krystyna convinced a Polish Olympic skier named Jan Marusas to guide her over the mountains. Marusas knew the Tatras better than almost anyone alive. He had competed internationally. He understood the terrain, the weather patterns, the avalanche zones, and the patrol schedules. Even he thought the crossing was madness. They set out in the dead of winter. That season was one of the worst on record in Central Europe. Temperatures dropped below -30 degrees Celsius. Snow was waist-deep in the valleys and chest-deep on the ridgelines. Wind chill made exposed skin freeze in minutes. Avalanche risk was constant. German patrols moved along the lower passes with dogs. Slovak border police watched the trails. Krystyna made the crossing on foot and on skis, carrying documents and rolls of microfilm strapped to her body beneath layers of clothing. The microfilm was pressed flat against her skin so it would not be found in a body search. If she was caught, the penalty was execution. She reached Warsaw. The city was under total German occupation. Jews were being forced into a ghetto. Polish intellectuals were being rounded up and shot. The Gestapo controlled every street corner. Christina moved through the city using forged papers, contacting resistance fighters and building a network of couriers and informants. She gathered intelligence on German troop movements, road and rail traffic, weapons production, and oil shipments from Romania's Ploiești oil fields that were fueling the German war machine. She photographed documents. She memorized locations. She recorded everything she could find about the German order of battle in occupied Poland. Then she crossed back over the Tatra Mountains to Budapest, carrying the intelligence with her. From Budapest, it was forwarded to London through diplomatic channels. She made several crossings that winter, back and forth through the frozen mountains, each time risking capture, each time carrying information that London desperately needed. On one crossing, she and Marisars were nearly caught by a German patrol. They lay face down in the snow for hours, not moving, barely breathing, and waiting for the soldiers to pass. The snow soaked through their clothing, the cold sank into their bones. They survived because they refused to move. She was the first woman to serve as a British agent in the field during the war. The Special Operations Executive did not even formally exist yet. It would not be established until July 1940. She was already working months before the organization that would later claim her was even created. In Budapest, she reunited with a childhood friend named Andrzej Kołeski, a one-legged Polish army officer who had lost part of his leg in a hunting accident before the war. Kołeski was running an escape line, smuggling Allied personnel out of occupied territory. He and Christina became partners in every sense of the word. They worked together. They lived together. They fell in love. Together, they built one of the most effective intelligence networks in Central Europe. Then in January 1941, the Gestapo caught them. Hungarian police arrested both of them in their Budapest apartment and handed them over to German intelligence. The interrogation lasted hours. Christina knew that if the Germans discovered what she had been doing, she and Kołeski would be executed. She needed to get out. She needed a plan. She found one in the scars on her own lungs. During the interrogation, Christina bit down on her own tongue until it bled. She coughed violently, spraying blood across the table. She told her interrogators she had advanced tuberculosis. She said she was dying. The German officers were terrified. Tuberculosis was one of the most feared diseases in Europe. It was highly contagious and often fatal. They sent her to a German doctor for examination. The doctor looked at her chest and found the old scars from the Fiat dealership, shadows on her lungs. He confirmed what she had told them. She appeared to have tuberculosis. The Gestapo released both her and Kołeski immediately. They did not want a dying woman contaminating their offices. But the Germans were not fools. They followed Christina and Kołeski after the release. The senior British diplomat in Hungary, Sir Owen O'Malley, arranged their escape. He issued them both British passports under new names. Kołeski became Andrew Kennedy. Christina became Christine Granville. She also shaved 7 years off her age on the new passport, claiming she had been born in 1915 instead of 1908. She would use the name Christine Granville for the rest of her life. O'Malley smuggled her out of Budapest in the boot of his Chrysler automobile. She and Kołeski crossed through Yugoslavia, Bulgaria, and Turkey, carrying microfilm containing intelligence about the German military buildup near the Soviet border. That intelligence is credited with foreshadowing Operation Barbarossa, the German invasion of the Soviet Union, months before it happened. Senior British officials reviewed her reports. Some historians believe Churchill himself read them and considered her his favourite agent. They arrived in Cairo, Egypt, by May 1941, and then everything stopped. British intelligence in Cairo grew suspicious of her. She had contacts with a Polish intelligence organisation called the Musketeers that the British did not trust. Her transit visas through Vichy territory had been obtained too easily. Someone suspected she might be a double agent. In June 1941, Peter Wilkinson of the Special Operations Executive dismissed her from service. She was given a tiny retainer, barely enough to survive. One internal report dismissed her as too extravagant to effectively operate undercover. For the next 3 years, Christine Granville, the woman who had skied across mountains and outsmarted the Gestapo, sat in Cairo doing nothing. She watched the Desert War unfold from a hotel room. She watched other agents receive assignments, training, and deployments. She petitioned every officer she could find to send her back into the field. She volunteered for missions to Hungary, to Poland, to anywhere behind enemy lines. Every request was denied. The British considered dropping her into Hungary, but concluded it would be little short of homicide. They considered Poland, but rejected that too. She was too well known, too conspicuous, too likely to be recognized. Meanwhile, her family was in danger. Her mother, Stefania, had remained in Warsaw. As a woman of Jewish heritage, she faced persecution and possible death under the German occupation. The news from Poland grew darker with each passing month. Kristina could do nothing to help. She was trapped in Cairo, surrounded by sand and bureaucracy, while everything she loved was being destroyed 4,000 miles away. She was sidelined, ignored, forgotten. The British had used her, doubted her, and discarded her. She spent 1941 to 1943 in a kind of exile, desperate to return to the fight, unable to convince anyone to let her back in. If you want to know how she got back into the war, and what she did when the Gestapo cornered the 3 most important Allied agents in southern France, please like this video. Every like pushes this story to someone who has never heard of Christine Granville. She was forgotten once. She does not deserve to be forgotten again. Please subscribe. In early 1944, an SOE officer named Patrick Howarth reviewed Christine Granville's file. He was appalled. Here was the longest-serving female agent in British intelligence, sidelined for 3 years because of bureaucratic suspicion that had never been substantiated. No evidence of double-dealing had ever been found. No proof of disloyalty had ever been produced. She had simply been abandoned by the system that had created her. Howarth reinstated her immediately. He cut through the red tape. He overruled the objections. He later said that the most useful thing he did in the entire Second World War was to reinstate Christine Granville. The SOE sent her to their training schools. She learned parachuting, weapons handling, demolitions, sabotage techniques, and what they called silent killing, the art of dispatching an enemy without making a sound. She trained in Algiers at the AMF section, the SOE's North African headquarters. The instructors noted that she excelled at almost everything. She was a natural with explosives. She was fearless on the parachute course. She had a gift for reading people and manipulating situations, but she was hopeless with wireless sets. She hated the tedium of Morse code and radio procedure. She disliked firearms as well, preferring to rely on her wits and her voice rather than a pistol. This was an unusual trait for a secret agent, but it defined her. Christine Granville's weapon was not a gun. It was persuasion. Plans to drop her into Hungary were rejected as too dangerous. The country was now under direct German occupation and swarming with Gestapo agents who knew her face. Plans to send her to Poland were also rejected. The risks were considered unacceptable. Instead, they decided to send her to southern France. She spoke perfect French with no detectable accent. She was fearless under pressure. She had already proven she could operate behind enemy lines for extended periods. And the Allies were about to launch a massive invasion of southern France that would require every capable agent they could deploy. On the night of July 6, 1944, Christine Granville jumped out of an aircraft into the darkness over southeastern France. She landed by parachute near the Vercors Plateau under the alias Pauline Armand. She was joining the Jockey Network, the largest and most important SOE circuit in southern France. The network was run by a man named Francis Cammerts. Cammerts was an unlikely spy. Born in London on June 16, 1916, to a Belgian poet father and an English actress mother, he had been a pacifist schoolteacher before the war. He registered as a conscientious objector in 1939. He refused to fight. Then in March 1941, his brother Peter was killed flying with the RAF. The death shattered his pacifism. He joined the SOE in 1942 and was parachuted into France in March 1943. By the summer of 1944, Cammerts had built the Jockey Network into an organization of more than 10,000 men and women stretching from Lyon to the Mediterranean coast and from the Swiss border to the Italian frontier. He stood 6 feet 4 inches tall. The French called him Big Feet. He was meticulous about security, never sleeping more than 3 or 4 nights in the same place, never telling anyone where he would be next. He was the most important SOE agent in southeastern France, and possibly in all of France. Christine became his courier, replacing a woman named Cecily Lefort, who had been captured by the Germans and would later die at Ravensbrück concentration camp. Within days, Christine proved herself to be far more than a courier. She became Cammert's de facto second in command. She traveled constantly through enemy territory, delivering messages, collecting intelligence, organizing parachute drop zones for weapons shipments, and keeping the scattered resistance groups connected and motivated. On July 14, 1944, Bastille Day, she helped coordinate one of the most extraordinary airdrops of the war. 72 American B-17 bombers of the United States 8th Army Air Force flew from England in broad daylight and dropped 862 containers holding 94 tons of weapons, ammunition, and explosives onto the Vercors Plateau. The drop zone was a field code named Tie Crayon near the village of Vassieux. It was part of Operation Cadillac, one of the largest daylight supply drops to the French resistance in the entire war. Christine was on the ground organizing reception committees, marking drop zones, and ensuring the containers were collected before German patrols could intercept them. The weapons armed thousands of Maquis fighters who were preparing to rise against the German occupiers in advance of the Allied landings. But the Maquis leadership on the Vercors made a fatal error. They launched their uprising prematurely, before the Allies could support them. The Germans responded with devastating force. On July 21, 1944, German glider troops and mountain infantry descended on the plateau. SS units swept through the villages. The Maquis fighters, outnumbered and outgunned, were massacred. Hundreds of French civilians were killed. Wounded resistance fighters were executed in their hospital beds. The Vercors uprising became one of the worst tragedies of the French resistance. Christine and Cammertz were on the plateau when the German assault began. They escaped on July 22, hiking roughly 70 miles over mountain terrain through Germans' patrols to a new base at Seine-les Alpes. The march took days. They traveled at night, hid during the day, and ate whatever they could find. In the Alps, Christine pulled off one of her most remarkable feats. At a German fortress on the Col de l'Arche, the mountain pass on the Franco-Italian border, she discovered that 63 of the 150 soldiers in the garrison were Polish conscripts. These were men classified by the Germans as Volksdeutsch, ethnic Germans from Western Poland. In reality, they were Polish citizens who had been forcibly conscripted into the Wehrmacht and given no choice about which side they fought on. Christine understood their situation instinctively. She was Polish. She knew what the occupation had done to their families. She knew they did not want to die for Hitler. Christine approached the fortress alone. She walked up to the perimeter and asked to speak with the Polish soldiers. When they were brought to her, she addressed them in fluent Polish. She told them who she was. She told them the Allies were coming. She told them the war was nearly over. She told them they had a choice that would determine the rest of their lives. Fight for Germany and die, or turn their weapons on their German officers and live as free Poles. She spoke to them about Poland, about what it meant to be Polish, about what their families would want them to do. The soldiers listened. Some wept. Days later, the 63 Polish conscripts mutinied. They turned their weapons on their German officers. The garrison surrendered to a small force of Maquis fighters and a British commando team from Operation Toplink. 63 men switched sides because one woman spoke to them in their mother tongue. Not a single shot was fired. Now, to understand what happened next, you need to understand the situation in southern France in August 1944. The Allies were planning a second invasion of France. Not from Normandy this time, but from the Mediterranean. The operation was originally called Anvil. It was later renamed Dragoon. Over 94,000 American French troops would land on the beaches of Provence on August 15, 1944, under the command of General Alexander Patch's 7th Army. The 6th Corps under General Lucien Truscott would lead the assault. The landing force included the American 3rd, 36th, and 45th Infantry Divisions and the 1st French Armoured Division. Opposing them was the German 19th Army under General Friedrich Wieser, part of Army Group G. The German defences were weak. Many of the garrison troops were second- and third-line soldiers, including large numbers of Polish, Russian, and other Eastern European conscripts who had no desire to fight for Germany. The SOE networks in southern France, including Cammert's jockey circuit, were critical to the invasion plan. Their job was to sabotage German communications, cut railroad lines, blow up bridges, ambush supply convoys, and keep the mountain roads open for the advancing Allied forces. The route from Cannes through Ding, Gap, and Grenoble was the main axis of advance for the fastest-moving Allied columns. Cammertz was the key to all of it. His network controlled the intelligence, the sabotage operations, and the coordination with over 10,000 armed Maquis fighters along the entire route. Without him, the network would fragment. The Maquis fighters would lose coordination. The invasion force would face stiffer resistance and slower progress. Cammertz was, in the judgment of London, irreplaceable. The Germans knew something was coming. They could see the build-up of Allied naval forces in the Mediterranean. They tightened security across southeastern France. They set up roadblocks on every major road. They checked papers. They searched vehicles. They arrested anyone who could not explain their business convincingly. On August 13, 1944, 2 days before the invasion, Francis Cammertz, Zan Fielding, and a French officer named Christian Sorensen were driving along a road toward Digne-les-Bains when they hit one of those roadblocks. Zan Fielding was another SOE agent, a brilliant linguist born in Uttarakhand, India, on November 26, 1918. He had been raised largely in Nice by his maternal grandparents and spoke French as fluently as English. Before the war, he was commissioned into the Cyprus Regiment. In 1942, he joined the SOE and was landed on the island of Crete, where he ran intelligence networks alongside Patrick Leigh Fermor against Rommel's supply lines. His work in Crete earned him the Distinguished Service Order. He later joked that he had received it simply for going into a town, but the reality was far more dangerous. He had walked openly into German-occupied territory to gather intelligence at enormous personal risk. He was one of the most experienced and decorated field agents in the SOE. In early 1944, he transferred to the French section and parachuted into southern France under the codename Cathedral, with the cover identity of Armand Ponlève. He was received by Cammertz and Christine and began working alongside them in the jockey network. Sorensen was a French officer attached to Cammert's team, a reliable and experienced man who knew the region. The three men were carrying large amounts of operational cash, money intended to pay Maquis fighters, purchase supplies, and fund sabotage operations. A young German civilian at the roadblock noticed something that the three agents had not anticipated. The banknotes in their possession carried serial numbers in the same series. SOE staff in Algiers had failed to scramble the serial numbers before distributing the operational cash. The matching numbers linked the three men together. It proved they were not random travelers, but an organized unit carrying coordinated funding. It was a catastrophic administrative failure thousands of miles from the roadblock, and it cost three men their freedom. The Germans arrested all three immediately. They were driven to the Gestapo headquarters in Dinglers-Bains and thrown into separate cells. They were beaten during interrogation. They were questioned for hours. They stuck to their cover story. They claimed to be black market traders. Nothing more. The Germans were not convinced, but they could not prove the three men were spies. Not yet. What the Germans did know was that three men traveling together with matching serial numbers on their cash were almost certainly up to something. They sentenced all three to be executed as spies. The execution was scheduled for the evening of August 17. They would be taken outside and shot. News of the arrest reached Christine Granville while she was near the Italian border, still working on subverting Polish conscripts in Germans' garrons. The message was brief and devastating. Cammertz had been taken. Fielding had been taken. Sorensen had been taken. They were in Digne prison. They were going to be shot. Christine acted immediately. She rushed back from the Col de l'Arche, stopping briefly to meet a newly arrived Allied military mission. She told them flatly that in Cammert's absence, she was in charge of the jockey network. Nobody argued with her. She then went to the local Maquis commanders and asked them to storm the prison. They refused. The risk was too great. The prison was inside German-held territory. An assault would get them all killed. Christine was on her own. She put aside her well-known hatred of bicycles and pedaled 40 kilometers over mountain roads to Dinglers-Bains. Alone, no escort, no backup, no weapon. She arrived in Digne on August 15, the same day that Operation Dragoon was hitting the beaches of Provence. Allied forces were landing 60 miles to the south. The liberation of southeastern France had begun, but it had not reached Digne yet. The town was still in German hands. The Gestapo still controlled the prison, and three men were still waiting to die. Christine's first move was to confirm that Cammertz was actually in the prison. She could not simply walk up and ask, so she circled the walls of the prison humming a tune, Frankie and Johnny. It was an American blues song that she and Cammertz both knew, a private signal between them. She hummed and she walked and she hummed. Then from inside the prison walls she heard it, a man humming the same melody back to her. Cammertz was alive, he was in there, he could hear her. Next, Christine approached an elderly French gendarme near the prison. She told him she needed to bring some necessities to her husband who was being held inside. The gendarme was sympathetic. He could not help her directly, but he put her in touch with a man who might be able to. His name was Albert Schenk. Schenk was an Alsatian, a man from the border region between France and Germany. He served as a liaison officer between the French prefecture and the German Sicherheitsdienst, the SD, the intelligence arm of the SS. Schenk was a collaborator. He had worked with the Germans throughout the occupation, but he was also a pragmatist. And the Allies had just landed on the beaches of Provence. Christine met Schenk and told him three things. First, she was a British agent. Second, she was the wife of Francis Cammertz. Third, she was the niece of Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery, the most famous British general in the war. None of this was true except the first claim. She was indeed a British agent. She was not Cammert's wife. She was certainly not Montgomery's niece. But she delivered these lies with absolute conviction. Then she added a threat. The Allies were advancing rapidly from the south. Within days, perhaps hours, they would reach Digne. When they arrived, collaborators like Schenk would be handed over to the mob. She had seen what happened to collaborators in liberated France. The crowds dragged them into the streets. The punishment was swift and public and brutal. Schenk's face went white. But Schenk told her he did not have the authority to release the prisoners. There was someone else she needed to see. A Belgian named Max Wem. Wem was a Gestapo officer with actual power over the prisoners. Schenk warned her that Wem would not even consider a deal for less than 2 million francs. Christine needed money she did not have. She contacted SOE headquarters in London by radio and requested an emergency airdrop of 2 million francs. London responded. The money was parachuted to her within 48 hours. 2 million francs in cash, dropped from a British aircraft into a field in occupied France to ransom 3 men from the Gestapo. On the afternoon of August 17, Christine returned to Digne with the money. Schenk introduced her to Wem. The meeting took place in Schenk's apartment. It began at 4 in the afternoon. The 3 men in the prison were scheduled to be shot that evening. Christine had hours, maybe less. What followed was 3 hours of the most audacious negotiation of the Second World War. Christine told Wem everything she had told Schenk. She was a British agent. She was Montgomery's niece. The Allies were coming, but she added new details. She told him she was a British parachutist in constant wireless contact with Allied forces closing in on Digne. To prove it, she reached into her bag and produced a set of wireless transmission crystals. She placed them on the table between them. The crystals were broken. They were completely useless. They could not transmit anything. But Wem did not know that. He saw the crystals and believed her. Then she described what would happen to him when the Allies arrived. She told him that he and Schenk had an infamous reputation among the local population. The people of Digne knew exactly who had worked with the Germans. They kept lists. They remembered names. She told him that when the Allies liberated the town, and they would liberate it within days, the collaborators would face the same justice they had faced everywhere else in France. In Normandy, in Brittany, in every town the Allies had liberated, the local population had dragged collaborators from their homes. Women who had slept with German soldiers had their heads shaved in the public square. Men who had worked for the Gestapo were beaten, shot, or hanged from lamp posts. This was not speculation, this was fact. It was happening across France at that very moment. Christine made it vivid. She made it personal. She described it slowly and clearly so that Wem could picture himself in those scenes. She watched his face change as the reality of his situation became clear. The war was ending. The Germans were losing. And Max Wem was a Belgian wearing the uniform of the SS in a French town that would soon be liberated by the Allies. His uniform, which had protected him for years, was about to become a death sentence. Wem grew increasingly agitated. At one point, he slammed the butt of his revolver on the table and demanded to know what she would do to protect him if he released the prisoners. Christine did not flinch. She promised him safe conduct. She promised that when the Allies arrived, she would personally guarantee his safety. She would protect him from the mob. She would ensure he was treated as a prisoner of war, not as a collaborator. All he had to do was release 3 men. The 2 million francs went to Schenk as his fee for making the introduction. Wem's price was not money. Wem's price was his life. The negotiation lasted 3 hours. 3 hours during which Christine Granville, a Polish countess working for British intelligence, sat in a room with a Gestapo officer and talked him out of executing 3 Allied agents. She had no leverage except her words. She had no power except her nerve. She had no backup except a bag of broken crystals and a suitcase full of cash. At the end of the 3 hours, Wem agreed. That evening, Max Wem put on his full SS uniform. He walked in the prison at Digne-les-Bains as if conducting routine business. He told the guards that the 3 prisoners were to be released into his custody for further interrogation at another facility. The guards did not argue. Wem outranked them. He had the authority. They did not ask questions. Kamertz, Fielding, and Sorensen were brought out of their cells. They had spent 4 days in that prison. They had been beaten. They had been told they would be shot. When Wem appeared in his SS uniform and ordered them to follow him, they assumed this was the end. They were being taken to their execution. Fielding later recalled that he was totally resigned to being shot. Wem marched the 3 men out of the prison and put them in a vehicle. Nobody spoke. The vehicle drove through the streets of Digne in the fading summer light. The town was quiet. German soldiers stood at checkpoints along the road. None of them stopped the vehicle. An SS officer transporting prisoners was routine. The vehicle headed toward the outskirts of town. At a riverbank outside Digne, the vehicle stopped. Christine was waiting in the shadows. She climbed into the vehicle without any sign of recognition. She did not look at Kamertz. She did not acknowledge Fielding or Sorensen. She sat down and stared forward. The 3 men assumed she was another prisoner. Perhaps she was being taken to the same execution. Nobody spoke. The silence was absolute. Then Wayne stopped the vehicle again. He got out. Zan Fielding watched as Wayne removed his SS tunic, folded it carefully, and began digging a hole by the riverbank. Fielding, not understanding what was happening, helped him dig. The Belgian buried his uniform in the French soil. Only then, standing by the river in his undershirt, did Wayne turn to the prisoners and tell them they were free. Only then did Cammertz look at Christine. Only then did anyone speak. The realization hit them like a physical blow. They were not going to die. They were standing by a river in the warm August evening, alive, because a woman they had known for 6 weeks had walked into the Gestapo and lied until they believed her. Cammertz later said he did not understand what was happening until he saw Christine by the river. He had been sitting in his cell expecting a bullet. Instead, he got a Polish countess with a bag full of francs and the audacity to bluff the SS years later. Christine told a fellow Polish veteran something remarkable about the negotiation. She said that during the entire 3 hours she sat across from Max Wayne, she had felt no fear at all. None. The danger had not registered. It was only afterward, when she and Cammertz and Fielding and Sorensen were standing by the river in the fading light, free and alive, that the full weight of what she had done hit her. She turned to the others and said, "What I have done, they could have shot me as well." The woman who had bluffed the Gestapo for 3 hours without flinching realized only afterward that she had been minutes from her own death the entire time. Fielding, in his 1954 memoir titled Hide and Seek, which he dedicated to the memory of Christine Granville, wrote that he owed his life directly to her. He said that her decision to risk herself was justified only because Cammertz's value to the Allied war effort tipped the scales. Had Cammertz not been among the prisoners, Fielding believed Christine would have been perfectly justified in taking no action. It was Cammertz's irreplaceability that made the gamble worth the cost, but Christine did not see it that way. She saw 3 men who were going to die, and she decided they would not. Christine had promised Wayne protection. She kept that promise. After the liberation, she fought SOE bureaucrats who wanted to arrest Wayne as a collaborator. She insisted he had kept his word and that she would keep hers. Schenck survived the war and returned to Belgium. Schenck was not so fortunate. Christine advised him to leave Ding immediately. He stayed. He was murdered sometime after the liberation, killed by persons unknown. His widow kept the 2 million francs, but could only exchange the old banknotes for a fraction of their original value. Cammertz and Christine later helped the widow return home. Digne-les-Bains was liberated by American forces on August 18, 1944, one day after the rescue. Task Force Butler, an armored column under Brigadier General Frederick Butler, swept through the region at extraordinary speed. The task force covered 235 miles in days and captured roughly 3,500 German prisoners. The Maquis fighters had cleared the way, cutting German communications and ambushing retreating columns exactly as Cammertz had organized them to do. Within days, Gap fell, then Sisteron, then Grenoble, liberated on August 22, far ahead of the Allied timetable. Marseille and Toulon fell on August 28, a full month earlier than planners had anticipated. The entire Allied advance through southeastern France moved faster than anyone in London or Washington had predicted. When Cammertz and Christine met Brigadier General Butler at Sisteron, Butler dismissed them as bandits. He did not believe they were Allied agents. Christine was furious. She had just saved the network that had cleared the road for Butler's tanks, and the American general was calling her a criminal. Butler's superior, General Alexander Patch, later corrected the mistake and appointed Cammertz and Christine as American liaison officers with the Maquis, but the insult stung. Cammertz, freed from Digne, immediately resumed command of the Jockey network. He coordinated Maquis operations across the entire region for the remaining weeks of the campaign. His Distinguished Service Order citation stated that on the day of the Normandy landings, his organization numbered 20,000 men, of whom at least 15,000 were fully armed. The liberation of southeastern France was accomplished in large part because of his network, and his network existed on August 18 because Christine Granville had refused to let him die on August 17. The SOE citation for Christine Granville's actions at Digne described them as one of the most remarkable personal exploits of the war. The recommendation went forward for the George Cross, the highest civilian gallantry award in Britain, equal in rank to the Victoria Cross. The citation used extraordinary language. It praised her nerve, her coolness, her devotion to duty, and her high courage. It called the rescue an astonishing coup. It recommended the George Cross without reservation. She received the George Medal instead, a lesser award. The recommendation had been downgraded somewhere in the chain of command. No official explanation was ever given for the reduction. The paperwork simply came back with a lesser medal attached. She also received the Order of the British Empire and the French Croix de Guerre, 3 decorations for 6 years of service that spanned 4 countries, 2 continents, and more close encounters with death than most soldiers experience in an entire career. Christine Granville had saved the most important SOE network in southern France. She had rescued the man who commanded 10,000 resistance fighters 2 days before the Allied invasion that depended on his leadership. She had persuaded 63 Polish conscripts to mutiny and surrender a German fortress without a shot being fired. She had smuggled intelligence across frozen mountains during the worst winter in a generation. She had outsmarted the Gestapo twice, in 2 different countries, years apart. She had done all of this while carrying no weapon and relying entirely on her voice, her nerve, and her ability to read the fear in other people's eyes. The SOE's own files described her as one of the most extraordinary agents they had ever employed. Vera Atkins, the intelligence officer who ran the women agents of the SOE, described Christine as very brave, very attractive, but a loner and a law unto herself. Christine had one final wartime assignment. In September 1944, she flew to London and was transferred from the FANY to the Women's Auxiliary Air Force as a flight officer. Churchill's cabinet had finally agreed to send SOE political missions to Poland to report on conditions under Soviet occupation. Christine was to be flown from the SOE base at Bari in southern Italy to act as a courier on one of these missions. The first team, codenamed Freston, parachuted into Poland on December 27, 1944. But within weeks, Soviet forces overran the team. All further missions were cancelled. Christine would never set foot in Poland again. Her homeland was now behind the Iron Curtain. The Poland she had fought for, the Poland she had skied across frozen mountains to reach, no longer existed as a free nation. The war ended in August 1945. Japan surrendered. The soldiers came home. The spies came home. The agents and couriers and wireless operators who had risked everything behind enemy lines returned to a country that had already forgotten them. Christine Granville returned to nothing. The SOE was disbanded. Her services were no longer required. She was dismissed with a month's pay. 1 month. That was what Britain gave its longest-serving female agent. No pension, no job, no support, no acknowledgement of 6 years of service. Just a handshake and an envelope. Zan Fielding, in his memoir, described a conversation in which Christine had spoken, half-jokingly, about the horrors of peace. She dreaded the prospect of life without the adventure, the camaraderie, and the sense of purpose that war had given her. She was right to dread it. Fielding later wrote bitterly that she had been left to fend for herself, despite needing security for life more than any agent they had ever employed. Christine was not even a British citizen yet. She had been using a British passport under a false name since 1941, but she had never been naturalized. After the Yalta Agreement handed Poland to the Soviet sphere of influence, she could not go home. She was effectively stateless, a woman without a country, without a job, without a future. Her naturalization as a British citizen was delayed for months. When it finally came through in December 1946, it was reportedly only because she threatened to refuse her George Medal and her OBE unless the government processed her papers. Britain had taken everything she had to give and then made her beg for citizenship. Christine tried to build a life in peacetime. She failed. She applied for a work permit to go to Kenya, where some former agents had settled. Denied. She tried to find work that matched her skills, but what employer wanted a former spy? She had no degree. She had no conventional work history. Her entire career was classified. She could not even explain to a potential employer what she had done for the past 6 years. She worked as a telephone operator. She worked as a saleswoman at Harrods department store in London. She worked as a waitress. She worked as a stewardess on ocean liners, first on a ship called the Ruahine, then on the Winchester Castle for the Union Castle Line. The woman who had commanded resistance armies and bluffed the Gestapo was serving meals on a passenger ship. Crew members on the Ruahine noticed the ribbons on her uniform. Enough medals to flatter a general, they said. They resented her for it. Who was this woman with all these decorations working as a stewardess? On the Ruahine, a fellow steward named Dennis George Muldowney appointed himself her protector. He defended her against the hostile crew members. They became involved, but Muldowney became obsessed. His affection turned to fixation. His fixation turned to possession. Christine tried to break away from him. She called him obstinate and terrifying. She ended the relationship. Muldowney would not accept it. On the evening of June 15, 1952, Christine Granville returned to the Shelburne Hotel at 1 Lexham Gardens in the Kensington district of London. It was a modest residential hotel. She had been living there in a small room. She was 44 years old. She had survived the Gestapo twice. She had survived frozen mountain crossings. She had survived parachute drops into enemy territory. She had survived the entire Second World War. At approximately 10:15 in the evening, Dennis Muldowney was waiting for her in the foyer. He had been drinking. He confronted her. Witnesses heard raised voices. She tried to walk past him toward the staircase. He pulled out a knife and stabbed her once through the chest. The blade penetrated her heart. She collapsed on the floor of the foyer and died almost immediately. Muldowney made no attempt to escape. He stood over her body and said 5 words. "I loved her. I killed her." He was arrested on the spot. The Metropolitan Police investigated. M5 and Special Branch monitored the case closely. Rumors circulated that the killing was a political assassination, perhaps connected to her wartime work, perhaps ordered by former Nazis or Soviet agents. The rumors were unfounded. It was exactly what it appeared to be. A possessive man who could not accept rejection. Muldowney was tried at the Old Bailey. He pleaded guilty to murder. He offered no defense. He was sentenced to death. On September 30, 1952, Dennis Muldowney was hanged at Pentonville Prison. His reported final words were chilling. "To kill is the final possession." The funeral was held on June 21, 1952, at St. Mary's Church in Kensal Green, London. Approximately 200 mourners attended. The First Aid Nursing Yeomanry, the FANY, the women's service through which Christine had officially served, provided a guard of honor. Among the mourners were Andrei Koweski, her lifelong partner, and Francis Kamertz, the man she had saved at Ding. Senior figures from the Special Operations Executive attended, including those who had overseen her missions. The people who knew best what she had done stood over her grave and said goodbye to the woman who had saved lives, served her country, and been abandoned by it. She was buried in St. Mary's Catholic Cemetery in Kensal Green. Her grave bears the shield of the Black Madonna of Częstochowa, the holiest icon in Poland. When Koweski died in Munich in December 1988, his ashes were interred at the foot of her grave. In death, they were finally reunited. Her SOE dagger, her medals, and her personal papers are held at the Polish Institute and Sikorski Museum in London. For decades after her death, Christine Granville was forgotten. Her story was classified. Her files were sealed. The SOE did not officially acknowledge its agents for years after the war. The public did not know her name. Historians who studied the war passed over her. She was a footnote in books about men. Francis Kamertz never forgot. He named his daughter Christine, born in 1948, after the woman who had saved his life. He wrote the foreword to the first biography of her, published by Madeleine Masson in 1975. He spoke about her whenever anyone would listen. His nephew, the celebrated children's author Michael Morpurgo, wrote a novel inspired by Kamertz's wartime story in 2018, ensuring that the legacy of the Jockey Network and the rescue at Digne reached a new generation of readers. Kamertz himself died in 2006 at the age of 90, still carrying the memory of that evening in Digne when he walked out of prison, expecting a bullet and found a Polish countess waiting by a river. Zan Fielding dedicated his 1954 memoir to the memory of Christine Granville. He wrote that he owed his life to her. He never stopped believing that her rescue at Digne was the single most extraordinary act of personal courage he had witnessed in the war. He died in Paris in 1991. It took decades for Christine Granville to receive the recognition she deserved. In 2012, the biographer Claire Mully published a book about her that brought her story to a wide audience for the first time. In 2013, the Polish Heritage Society renovated her grave at Kensal Green. In 2017, a bronze bust of her was unveiled at the Polish Hearth Club in London. In September 2020, after a 6-year campaign led by Claire Mully, English Heritage installed a blue plaque at 1 Lexham Gardens, the site where she was murdered. The plaque reads Christine Granville, George Medal, OBE, Croix de Guerre, Special Operations Executive Agent, lived and died here. Christine Granville's story asks questions that military historians and intelligence professionals still debate. What does a nation owe the people who fight its secret wars? The men who stormed the beaches of Normandy came home to parades. The pilots who flew the bombers came home to medals and pensions and the gratitude of a nation. Christine Granville came home to a month's pay and a job serving drinks on an ocean liner. Britain knew what she had done. The files were there. The citations were written. The witnesses were alive. The nation simply chose not to care. The question is not whether she was brave or effective. Digne answered that. The liberation of southeastern France answered that. The question is what happens to the people a nation uses and then discards. The spies who cannot talk about what they did. The agents who cannot prove their service. The women who fought in a war that officially never employed them in combat. Christine Granville lived that question every day from 1945 until the night she died in a London hotel foyer. Her story is not a story about espionage. It is a story about the gap between what a country asks of its people and what it gives them in return. A woman who saved lives was left to scrub decks. A woman who commanded resistance armies was denied citizenship until she threatened to return her medals. A woman whose superiors called her actions one of the most remarkable personal exploits of the entire war was recommended for Britain's highest civilian honour and received a lesser one instead. No explanation, no apology, just silence. The men she saved did not forget. Cammertz named his daughter after her. Fielding dedicated his memoir to her memory. Koeski's ashes were buried at the foot of her grave. But the institution she served forgot her the moment the war ended. Digne-les-Bains is a quiet town today. The prison where Cammertz, Fielding, and Sorensen awaited executions still stands. The apartment where Christine negotiated with Max Wehm is still there. The riverbank where Wehm buried his SS tunic has been swallowed by vegetation. The roads where Christine pedaled her bicycle through occupied territory are now tourist routes through Provence. At the Kensal Green Cemetery in London, her grave is visited by people who have read her story. Polish visitors leave flowers. British veterans leave poppies. Students from the intelligence services leave nothing visible but spend a long time standing there. The grave is modest. The inscription is simple. Christine Granville, George Medal, her dates, nothing else is needed. But the fact that it took until 2020 and a 6-year campaign to put a plaque on the building where she died tells you everything about how Britain treated the woman who saved British lives when no one else could. She wanted to fight. They let her fight. She wanted to serve. They let her serve. And when the fighting was done and the serving was over, they let her go. They let her die in a hotel foyer at the age of 44, murdered by a man she could not escape, in a country she had given everything to protect. That is the story of Christine Granville, a Polish countess who became a British spy, a woman who skied across frozen mountains, bluffed the Gestapo, turned enemy soldiers, and rescued condemned men. She asked for nothing, she got less than nothing. But the 3 men who walked out of that prison in Digne-les-Bains walked out because of her. They lived because she refused to let them die. And the Allied advance through southeastern France succeeded because Cammertz was alive to lead his network through the liberation. Every road that stayed open, every bridge that was sabotaged, and every German convoy that was ambushed in the weeks after Digne happened because Christine Granville rode a bicycle through enemy territory and lied to the Gestapo until they believed her. Now you know her name. But most people do not. Most people have never heard of Christine Granville. That is where you come in. Hit that like button right now. Not for us, for her. Every like sends this video to someone new, someone who should know what this woman did. Hit subscribe, turn on notifications. We dig through classified files, through declassified SOE records, through Medal of Honor citations and George Medal recommendations to find people like Christine Granville. People who were forgotten, people who were denied, people whose service sat in filing cabinets for decades while the world moved on. We pull them out. We tell their stories every week. Drop a comment below. Tell us where you are watching from. United States, United Kingdom, Canada, Australia, Poland, France. We have viewers on every continent. Every one of you is part of this. Every comment, every share, every like keeps these stories from disappearing. Tell us if someone in your family served in the war. Tell us their name. Tell us their branch. This comment section is not just a comment section. It is a roll call, and every name matters. Thank you for watching. Thank you for staying until the end. And thank you for making sure that Christine Granville, the Polish countess who bluffed the Gestapo and saved 3 men from a firing squad, finally gets what Britain denied her for the rest of her life. Recognition.